He laughed at the old man and his strange way of fishing. But winter struck, and there was no food left. What this old man did on the ice turned everything upside down. Look how pride breaks before the cold. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The winter had come early to Iron Lake, earlier than anyone in the town had expected, and with a kind of fierce, unrelenting intensity that made even the oldest residents shake their heads and mutter that something about the season felt wrong. Houses that usually stood steady against December winds creaked in protest as January storms arrived a full month ahead of time, smothering the rooftops with drifts so high that homeowners dug tunnels rather than paths. Every tree, every fence post, every corner of the frozen earth carried the weight of a winter that seemed determined to press the land into silence. Iron Lake itself had frozen into a sheet of almost metallic blue, thick enough to swallow sound. When people walked across it, their boots struck a surface so dense and cold that each step felt like tapping glass with a hammer. The ice wasn't just a barrier, it was a kind of second skin over the lake, a hardened armor forged by temperatures that sometimes plunged past -35 degrees. The cold seized hold of fingers and toes within minutes. Even machines faltered. The augers sputtered, the generators stuttered, and diesel engines groaned with the slowness of syrup. For the young fishermen of the town, Jacob, Tommy, Kevin, and the Holt brothers, winter had always been harsh, but never quite like this. They had grown up hearing stories about old days, when the cold crawled inside houses through the smallest cracks, when people slept under piles of blankets and hung quilts over doors to keep rooms warm. Yet for all the talk, those young men had believed that modern tools, new gear, and thick insulated boots made them stronger than their fathers and grandfathers had been. They liked to tell each other that they were the new generation of Iron Lake fishermen, the ones who could handle anything the winter pushed their way. But this year, winter seemed determined to humble them. Most mornings, they rose before dawn, when the wind rattled the siding of their homes like a warning. They trudged out to the lake, hauling augers, sleds loaded with gear, little propane heaters, and insulated tents that promised comfort, but delivered very little of it. They drilled their holes, set their lines, and waited in the cold. And they waited. Hours went by. The heaters hissed until their tanks emptied, and the coffee in their thermoses turned lukewarm. When they lifted their lines for the 10th time, they often found nothing but water stiffening into ice the moment the line touched air. The fish that normally swirled beneath the lake's surface had vanished toward deeper pockets of warmth, leaving the young fishermen frustrated and empty-handed. It didn't take long for their families to feel the absence. Freezers that once held fillets of walleye and northern pike began to look like barren caverns. Shelves and cupboards carried only dry goods. Gas for generators cost more than usual. The town grocery store struggled to get shipments through the snow-choked roads. People tried to hide their worry, but worry had a way of settling itself in the eyes. It lived there quietly, like a shadow behind a smile. Whenever the young men walked home after another fruitless morning, their footsteps slow, their shoulders heavy with cold and disappointment, they sometimes passed the small cabin belonging to the old fisherman, Hank Doyle. Hank had lived on the outskirts of Iron Lake for more than 2 decades, long enough to have seen each of the young men in town grow from boys into adults. And though most people respected him in a polite, distant way, the younger fisherman liked to say he had grown strange with age. He wore the same battered fur hat he'd worn for years. His coat was thick, heavy, and patched in more places than anyone could count. The wind always seemed to toss his white beard into disarray, and yet somehow there was something sturdy and immovable about the man, as though he belonged to the snow, the way birch trees belonged to the forest. Hank carried his tools the way others carried groceries, without effort, with an ease earned through decades of necessity. Instead of a modern auger, he hauled an old iron-tipped chopping axe, a long-handled pike, and a custom-built wooden sled stacked with panels of wood, rope, and a net that had clearly seen many years of use. He would walk onto the lake early each morning, long before the sun had pushed any light across the horizon. Some mornings, the young fishermen saw him out there before they even reached their spots, his breath rising like smoke in the frigid air as he studied the ice beneath his boots. They laughed at him. They didn't mean true harm by it. Most of them didn't know how to aim cruelty with real intention, but the laughter still landed sharp. "There he goes again," Tommy said one morning, nodding toward the lone figure bending over the ice. "He's going to build himself a swimming pool one of these days, the way he chops at that lake." "Swimming pool?" Kevin snickered. "More like a crater. Man's one blow away from falling straight into Canada." Even Jacob, usually quieter than the others, couldn't help but chuckle. It was easier to laugh at the oddity of the old man's methods than to face the truth that their own weren't working. The Holt brothers, big men with broad shoulders and booming laughs, joined in whenever the opportunity arose. They were good guys at heart, but winter had made everyone testier, quicker to judge. Watching Hank chip away diligently at the ice, using tools older than some of their fathers, made them feel strangely defensive, as though Hank's success, small as it seemed, was a silent accusation about their own failures. The young men stood by their small holes in the ice, bundled in the latest winter gear, gripping rods made with carbon fiber and reels designed for precision. Yet their lines remained empty, while Hank worked for hours, carving an enormous circle through inches and inches of thick ice. He didn't drill a hole. He didn't punch a narrow window into the water. He carved out a space so large that the first time Tommy saw it completed, he stared with his jaw slack. "Why the hell would anyone cut something that big?" he muttered. "He's gonna drown himself one of these days." But Hank never did. In fact, he moved around the massive circle with a certainty that defied age. And when he finally dipped his heavy net into the water, he sometimes pulled up more fish in one scoop than the young men had caught all week. They didn't see how he did it. They only saw the results. Some evenings, as Hank loaded fish into a burlap sack and tied it closed with thick twine, a few kids from town ran by his cabin, carrying insulated jugs, laughing about the warmth inside their homes. The sound carried across the frozen yard. But when the kids reached their next stop, they often found a small bag of fish waiting for them on the porch, left quietly, without a knock, without explanation. The adults in town knew Hank was responsible, even if he never said a word. But he had always been this way, giving in silence, watching without needing to be seen. Still, none of that mattered to the young fishermen. Not at first. As far as they were concerned, they were the ones who understood fishing in the modern world. They had grown up with technology. They had watched videos online about ice fishing strategies. They had bought gear recommended by catalogs and shops. They believed they were the natural successors to the town's old fishing traditions, which made it all the more infuriating that they were failing, and that Hank, using nothing but a weather-beaten set of tools and a method nobody had bothered to learn, was succeeding. Their frustration deepened when the stories began trickling through town that Hank had quietly delivered fish to several struggling families. A grandmother who lived alone said she had found 3 cleaned walleye arranged on her doorstep. A couple with a newborn mentioned that someone had left a small pail of lake trout by their back door. No one claimed it, but everyone knew. Jacob heard these whispers, and although he never said it out loud, envy flickered somewhere beneath the surface of his thoughts. Part of him wanted to believe that the stories were exaggerated. How could Hank possibly catch so much when everyone else was struggling? But each morning, the truth became harder to deny. Hank was working differently. and differently in Iron Lake sometimes meant better. One morning, Jacob arrived earlier than usual. The cold bit at his cheeks and stung his fingers even inside thick gloves. A halo of breath rose in front of him with every exhale, and his boots made a cracking sound as he crossed the lake. When he reached his usual spot, he noticed a dark silhouette already forming in the distance. Hank was out there. Jacob paused, staring. There was something strange about watching someone that old move with such deliberate strength in such brutal conditions. Hank wasn't fast, but every motion he made had purpose. Jacob saw him lift his axe, bring it down, lift it again. He worked as though the cold didn't touch him, as though he had been carved from the same ice beneath his boots. Jacob felt a twinge of something he couldn't name. Admiration, maybe. Or guilt. Or both. As the sun began its slow climb toward the horizon, staining the sky with pale streaks of light, the other young fishermen joined Jacob. They greeted him with jokes and laughter, but it was strained. Everyone felt the tension of another likely empty day. They set up their gear, drilled their holes, and tried to settle into the rhythm of waiting. But Jacob found himself glancing again and again toward the old man across the lake, watching as the circle in the ice grew larger with every swing of Hank's axe. Jacob tried to ignore the feeling building inside his chest, though he couldn't quite name it. The truth was simple. Hank knew something they didn't, and winter was only growing colder. When afternoon settled in and the sun dipped low again, the young fishermen packed up and prepared to head home. Their buckets were nearly empty once more. Frustration weighted each step they took. Tommy cursed under his breath about the cold. The Holt brothers argued about whether to try another spot tomorrow. Kevin blamed his failing gear, but as Jacob turned to leave, he stopped. He saw Hank heaving a heavy net from the water spraying into the air like shards of glass. He watched the old man haul a weight so large that he had to lean back for balance, and then he saw the gleam of fish. Many fish, big fish, spilling into the sled at Hank's feet. Jacob's breath caught. There was no denying it anymore. Hank Doyle might have been old. He might have seemed strange. He might have used methods no one else did. But he was catching fish. Real fish. Enough to feed himself. Enough to feed others. Enough to survive a winter that showed no mercy. And Jacob suddenly felt the first ripple of fear. Not of the winter. Not of the cold. But of the possibility that he and the others had been wrong all along. That fear stayed with him as he walked home, carrying nothing but the memory of Hank lifting that great net from a dark circle in the ice. It stayed with him through dinner, when he ate the last of the canned soup in silence, while his wife coughed weakly in the next room, and his daughter asked why they didn't have any fish like her friend's family. It stayed with him when he lay in bed, unable to sleep, staring through the window at a sky so clear and cold that the stars seemed frozen in place. Jacob didn't know it yet, but winter was about to push him further than he had ever been pushed before. The cold had a way of scraping away pride, one layer at a time, until only truth remained. And the truth was waiting for him in the dark. Old hands of the man the young fisherman had spent the whole season laughing at. Jacob did not sleep much that night. The cold had a way of working itself into a man's bones, but it was not the cold that kept him awake. It was the image of Hank Doyle standing over that massive circle in the ice, pulling up fish with a steady strength that defied age. Jacob lay there in the dim light of his bedroom, listening to the soft, uneven breathing of his wife in the next room and the faint rustle of blankets as his daughter shifted in her sleep. Their small house felt even smaller during winter, the walls groaning as the wind pressed against them like a restless hand. Inside, it was quiet enough for Jacob to hear everything that mattered. His wife's cough, the ticking of the old clock, his own heart pounding with a weight he hadn't felt before. He had known hunger in small ways growing up, in the dry months when work was scarce, but he had never felt the kind of looming threat that now hung over his family. It wasn't just the lack of fish. It was the feeling that he had failed them, that he had gone out day after day, insisting he could provide only to return with nearly nothing. He had told himself this winter was different, that nobody was catching much, that the storms were harsher than usual. But excuses didn't fill plates. All the while, Hank was feeding half the town. Sometime after midnight, as Jacob sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands and the last of the fire dying in the stove, he understood that something had to change. Pride had carried him as far as it could, and now it had become a burden too heavy for him to lift. His daughter's voice echoed in his ears, as clear and fragile as if she were standing beside him. "Papa, I don't want cold cereal again." He would have carried a mountain on his back before letting her go hungry, but he could not carry this winter alone. By the time he stepped outside, the air was so sharp it stole his breath. Frost clung to the windows like a thin veil, and the sky glimmered with a hard, brittle light from the stars. Jacob trudged through the snow, each step crunching like shattered glass beneath his boots. The wind pressed against him, pulling at his coat, whispering warnings he refused to hear. He made his way along the road toward Hank's cabin, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly in his gloved hand. The darkness around him felt alive, swallowing sound. His breath formed clouds that immediately crystallized, falling in tiny crystals that sparkled briefly before disappearing. As he approached the old cabin, he hesitated. The place looked like something pulled from another time. An old porch, sagging under the weight of snow, a chimney releasing a thin ribbon of smoke, and a lantern glowing faintly through a frost-covered window. Jacob took a deep breath and knocked on the door. A moment later, the door opened with a slow, deliberate motion. Hank stood framed in the warm light of the cabin, wearing his old flannel shirt and heavy wool socks. He looked as though he had been expecting someone. Jacob felt his throat tighten. He tried to speak, but the words tangled together. Finally, he managed. I need help." Hank studied him with those steady eyes, the eyes of a man who had weathered hundreds of storms and could see through a man like ice on the lake. There was no judgment there, no gloating, only understanding, only truth. "Come back tomorrow at 5, Hank said quietly. "Bring your axe, and leave your pride home." Jacob nodded, swallowing hard. It was both an order and an invitation, and something in Hank's tone told him that this was not a request to take lightly. Hank closed the door gently, and Jacob walked back home through the cold, feeling a strange mixture of fear and relief. When he finally crawled into bed, he fell asleep almost instantly. The next morning, when the first pale hint of dawn crept across the horizon, Jacob walked onto the lake with his tools. The cold bit at his cheeks like thousands of tiny needles, but he kept moving. The sky above him glowed faintly pink and blue, and the surface of Iron Lake was a vast, unbroken sheet of white, except for the large, dark circle already carved into the ice, where Hank stood waiting. Hank didn't wave or greet him loudly. He simply nodded as Jacob approached, as though they had always been meant to meet here at this hour. To Jacob's surprise, he wasn't alone for long. Not 10 minutes later, Tommy appeared, his breath forming clouds in front of him. He walked carefully across the ice, holding his own tools. When Jacob raised an eyebrow, Tommy shrugged and said with a crooked grin, "Thought I'd come watch the show." But he stayed close, his posture betraying uncertainty he tried to hide under humor. A little while later, the Holt brothers arrived. They approached from opposite sides of the lake, their heavy frames moving through the snow like tired giants. They didn't joke or laugh like usual. Their faces were drawn, their movements slow but purposeful. They needed help too. Winter had stripped them all down to the truth. When Hank saw them, He didn't scold or ask questions. He simply said, "Good. More hands mean more work done." And work was exactly what Hank expected. The old man spent the next hour explaining the first lesson, how to choose the right spot. He spoke not of maps or depth charts, but of subtle things, patterns in the ice, faint lines of cracks, the echoes of water moving beneath. He taught them how to feel the lake under their boots, how to hear the difference in sound when the ice was thickest or thinnest. They listened, first skeptically, then with dawning respect, as Hank demonstrated how to test the ice with the pike, how to measure the shift in weight without relying on instruments. His movements, slow and deliberate, were the product of decades spent surviving winters harsher than this one. He didn't hurry. He didn't waste breath. Every word was practical. Every action was necessary. When it came time to carve the circle, the young men realized how hard the work truly was. Hank directed them with short, precise instructions. Cut here. Wait. Let the fracture spread. Cut again at an angle. Use the pike to break off small pieces instead of large ones. It was exhausting. Their arms burned. Their breath came in ragged bursts, fogging their vision. The wind whipped snow into their faces and stung their skin with icy pellets. The Holt brothers grunted with effort. Tommy swore under his breath. Jacob struggled to keep going, his muscles screaming, his hands numb despite the thick gloves. But Hank never slowed. He moved with the rhythm of a man who had done this so many times that it was part of him, like a second nature passed down through years of hardship. Every now and then, he paused to let the young men catch up, but even then he stood tall, like a steady pillar in the storm. When the circle finally cracked, and a large slab of ice lifted from the water, Jacob felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just the accomplishment of carving the hole, it was the realization of how much he had underestimated the old man, how much they all had. Once the circle was cleared, Hank demonstrated how to guide the fish toward the opening. He tapped the ice in patterns, stirred the water with the pike, and used a small lantern to draw movement beneath the surface. It seemed impossible that fish could be coaxed from deeper passages, but minutes later, Jacob saw shadows moving through the water, dark shapes gliding toward the opening. Hank's method wasn't magic, it was knowledge. Hard-earned knowledge born from winters, spent fighting for survival in places far colder than Iron Lake. The first fish came slowly, cautiously, then another, and then a rush of movement, like a hidden river revealing itself. Hank lowered the heavy net into the water with practiced ease, and the young men watched in awe as he hauled up a catch, larger than anything they had seen all winter. The fish flopped and shimmered, their scales catching the pale morning light. Jacob's throat tightened. Tommy let out a low whistle. The Holt brothers looked at each other with something like disbelief, but Hank didn't gloat. He didn't smile smugly or mock their previous disbelief. Instead, he simply said, "Your turn." Their first attempts were clumsy. The net slipped. The angles were wrong. The fish escaped. But with Hank watching, correcting, and guiding them, they slowly began to understand. Their arms trembled from strain, and their boots were soaked with icy water. But they kept trying. And finally, after almost an hour, they lifted their first real haul of the season. 10 fish, then 12, then 15. Enough to feed families who had begun to lose hope. They stood there on the ice, breathing hard, staring at the shimmering pile in the sled. None of them spoke. They didn't have to. The moment was heavy with gratitude, relief, and the first fragile threads of respect. By the time they walked back to town with their full sleds, everyone who saw them sensed something had changed, and something had. They weren't just young men chasing fish anymore. They were students, learning from a master. Hank Doyle had begun to teach them how to survive, But more than that, he was teaching them how to set aside pride, how to listen, and how to endure a winter that cared nothing for youth or confidence. As the sun dipped toward the horizon and Iron Lake glowed with the fading light of day, Jacob felt something he hadn't felt all winter. Hope. And he knew this was only the beginning. The following days brought a new rhythm to Iron Lake, one shaped not by frustration or empty-handed trudges home, but by purpose, quiet determination, and the unmistakable sense that the worst of winter could finally be met with something stronger than despair. What had begun as a desperate walk through the cold for Jacob had grown into something far larger, something the whole town would soon feel. It wasn't just about learning a new method of fishing. It was about confronting winter with unity instead of pride. Each morning, well before the first thin line of dawn cut across the frozen horizon, Jacob returned to the lake with Tommy, the Holt brothers, and sometimes Kevin, when he didn't need to tend to his sick mother. Their footsteps fell in steady rhythm across the groaning ice, breaths forming clouds that drifted upward into the brittle air. None of them talked much in those early hours. Words seemed too fragile to carry across the silence of Iron Lake at dawn. The cold was fierce enough to numb thoughts, and yet beneath that cold, something warm was growing. A sense of belonging, of standing shoulder to shoulder against the elements and learning an art older than themselves. Hank was always there before them. His silhouette rose from the shadows like an extension of the ice itself, solid and unmoving. He greeted them with a nod or a quiet grunt, nothing more, and then began instructing them with the same steady simplicity that had guided them through their first painful attempts. The young men now listened with a focus they had never shown before. Every detail mattered: the position of their boots, the angle of the axe, the way their weight shifted as they struck the ice. Hank corrected their stances, adjusted their grips, and repeated lessons as often as it took. By the end of the week, the young fishermen no longer carved crooked half-circles or splintered the ice in unpredictable ways. Their motions, once jagged and uncertain, began to mirror Hank's slow, precise, and efficient. They learned when to strike hard and when to let the ice crack naturally. They learned to read the faint sounds the lake made, to understand when a shift beneath their feet meant stronger currents or weaker ice. It was a kind of language, one they had never heard until now. And Iron Lake noticed. It started with whispers in the grocery store, murmurs exchanged between neighbors as they brushed snow from their coats. People saw Jacob and the others returning with full sleds of fish-fat walleye, shimmering lake trout, and perch big enough to feed a family of 4. They saw the Holt brothers carrying baskets to widows and single parents whose cupboards had begun to empty. They watched Tommy deliver fish to the old man on Redwood Street, who could barely shovel his own porch. The generosity spread so quickly, it seemed to glow through the town like a slowly rising sun. Children peeked through frosted windows as the fishermen passed. Elderly couples murmured thanks even before the men arrived at their doors. A sense of relief, real, deep relief, settled over Iron Lake. But with that relief came a growing curiosity, and before long, everyone in town knew exactly who to thank. Hank Doyle became the name on everyone's lips. In the past, people had spoken of him with polite distance, as though his solitude made him impossible to approach. They had respected him, but never truly known him. Now they spoke of him with admiration, gratitude, and something nearing reverence. Some recalled stories he had let slip over the years about his time in Alaska, the brutal seasons he had survived, the tribal fishermen who had taught him the methods he now passed on. Others simply marveled that one man at his age had managed to keep an entire town from falling into hunger. Of course, Hank himself ignored the attention. When people came to his cabin to thank him, He politely accepted the pies and jars of preserves they brought, gave a brief nod, and went back to mending his nets or sharpening his axe. He didn't do any of this for praise. He did it because Winter had always taught him that survival wasn't something won alone. Soon, more young men began arriving at the lake, even earlier than Jacob's group. The first to join were Derek and Milo, two cousins who had been trying unsuccessfully to support their large family. Then came a few teenagers from the high school, boys eager to prove themselves and relieved to leave their cluttered homes, where parents whispered anxiously about dwindling supplies. They followed Jacob and the others across the ice, stamping their boots to stay warm, watching Hank with wide, uncertain eyes. Hank didn't turn them away. Instead, he simply added them to the work. The lake no longer held only one carved circle. It held 3, then 4, then 5. The ice became a living classroom where the old fisherman taught dozens of people at once. He moved from group to group, correcting their stances, pointing out mistakes, demonstrating again and again how to work with the lake instead of against it. And though his voice was quiet, every instruction carried the authority of a man who had survived winters far worse. Jacob began to notice the way Hank's presence changed the mood among the fishermen. The younger ones no longer competed with each other or bragged about who caught the biggest fish. They helped one another with frozen ropes, steadying nets, sharing thermoses, and laughing, not with mockery, but with relief and camaraderie. Winter no longer felt like an adversary seeking to break them apart. It felt like a challenge they were finally meeting together. Some days were easier. The fish swam eagerly toward the circles, responding to the patterns Hank had taught them to create. The nets came up heavy, and the laughter of the young men echoed across the lake, like music carried by the wind. Other days were harder. Storms swept across Iron Lake with blinding snow that stung their faces. The wind roared so fiercely, it felt like it could knock a man off his feet. On those days, Hank's instructions became even more valuable, for he taught them how to move low against the wind, how to anchor the nets so they wouldn't tear, and how to judge when it was too dangerous to stay. Through it all, the town grew stronger, and with strength came gratitude. One morning, as the group made their way across the frozen lake, they were joined by townsfolk who simply wanted to watch. Bundled in coats, scarves, and mittens, families stood at a distance, pointing with awe as the young men carved their circles and drew fish from the icy depths. Children pressed close to their parents' sides, eyes shining with wonder. Some of the townspeople brought hot cocoa, passing a thermos from hand to hand, letting the warmth seep into fingers stiff with cold. Others simply stood silently, as though witnessing something sacred. Jacob could not help noticing how often their gazes drifted toward Hank. The old man didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he did and chose not to react. He kept working, methodical and calm, moving through the steps of his craft, with the grace of a man who had spent his entire life mastering it. When the fishermen returned to town that day, sleds heavy with fish, they found something unexpected waiting for them. A group of townspeople stood outside the general store, shovels in hand, clearing a path not just for themselves, but for everyone. Others were repairing fences damaged by the winter storms. A few teenagers were stacking firewood outside the home of an elderly couple who lived near the edge of town. It was as if Hank's quiet example had sparked something Iron Lake had not felt in a long time: unity. As February crept closer, the storms grew more severe. The sky often remained gray for days, thick with the promise of snow. Roads vanished beneath drifts so high they resembled frozen waves. But the young fishermen never missed a morning. Neither did Hank. They arrived earlier and worked harder, knowing that every fish they caught kept the town alive. Then came the day when the entire town decided to honor the man who had changed everything. It began as a simple conversation between neighbors, how best to thank Hank, how to show him what his guidance had meant. People spoke of buying him new equipment, but Hank would never accept it. Someone suggested naming a dish after him at the diner, but that felt too small. And then old Mrs. Talbot, who had lived in Iron Lake nearly as long as Hank had, spoke up from her rocking chair. "If the lake is where he saved us, then the lake is where we should honor him." The idea caught like fire. Within a week, the townspeople gathered wood, tools, nails, and paint. They trudged onto the lake in groups, their coats dusted with frost and cheeks glowing from the cold. Jacob, the Holt brothers, Tommy, Kevin, Derek, Milo, and many others worked side by side, hauling planks and hammering boards into place. They built a small but sturdy wooden dock that extended over the very area where Hank had carved his first great circle of the winter. At the end of the dock, they mounted a beautifully carved wooden sign made by one of the town's best craftsmen. Hank Doyle's Circle Hole, where the old ways saved us. When Hank finally walked across the lake to see what they had built, he stopped in his tracks. The wind tugged gently at his beard as he stared at the sign. His eyes softened, and for a moment, the young men saw something they had never expected: emotion, deep and raw, shining beneath his weathered exterior. He didn't speak right away. He simply stood there, letting the weight of the moment rest on his shoulders. Then he ran a hand over the carved letters, his fingers trembling slightly, as though feeling the truth of the words more than the wood itself. "You didn't have to do this," he finally said, his voice softer than they had ever heard it. Jacob stepped forward. "We wanted to." The old man looked at the group before him, the young fishermen who had once laughed at him, who now stood together, not as skeptics, but as students, as companions, as men changed by what they had learned. His gaze lingered on Jacob, and he gave a small, proud nod. "You learned well," he said. "All of you." That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of gold and violet, Iron Lake stood still, beneath the weight of winter. Yet for the first time in months, the cold did not feel threatening. Inside countless homes, families cooked fish fresh from the lake, filling their kitchens with warmth and the comforting smell of a hard-earned meal. Laughter drifted through windows. Stories were shared. The town felt alive again. And as Hank walked home across the snow-covered path, his breath rising in gentle clouds, he carried with him the quiet knowledge that he had passed something important to the next generation, not just a skill, but a spirit, a way of standing together, of enduring hardship through cooperation and humility, a reminder that survival was not merely about strength, but about listening, learning, and sharing what one knew. Winter would come again. It always did. But Iron Lake would meet it, not with fear, nor with pride, but with unity forged in ice, and guided by the steady hands of an old fisherman who had once stood alone. Not anymore. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe, check out the next videos, and explore more stories on the channel. And feel free to share this video with others.